Foreshadowing is one of those terms that gets thrown around quite a lot by writers and reviewers alike, but is perhaps a commonly misunderstood or misrepresented term. At its most basic, we should imagine foreshadowing like the writer planting seeds for future events to grow out of. The seeds must be buried sufficiently so that they aren't obvious, but not so deep that they are unavailable to readers who will be completely blindsided by the outcome. Foreshadowing acts as a great tool in an author's arsenal, as they allow you to build anticipation and suspense that things will happen later as a consequence of present or past actions. This is akin to tension in many ways, but more focused on the story elements rather than the scene or atmospherics. A key element to creating good foreshadowing is that hints and clues line up coherently, logically, and consistently post-revelation. That means using concepts such as symbolism, passing comments from characters, and drawing attention to seemingly innocuous details can be reflected on by the reader with greater significance. When we look at works such as Harry Potter, where Voldemort is alluded to and the prophecy of his destruction becomes more and more apparent in the later books, we can see a consistent and powerful use of foreshadowing. The slow dawning over the series that Harry is the chosen one is very useful for character development, but also for building tension and anticipation for the climactic showdown in the final installment. Conversely, however, the same series is often quite heavy-handed with its foreshadowing by introducing fairly blunt prophecies that don't leave much ambiguity as to what the final outcome is likely to be. Today then, I want to walk you through 3 important areas of foreshadowing that you need to get correct, along with some examples that highlight the do's and don'ts. The first area that you need to nail for effective foreshadowing is one that has been mentioned already. That is to keep many of your cards close to your chest, and only give enough information that the pieces fit together post-watch. I recently watched a Vietnamese horror story, which had appallingly bad foreshadowing. Everything was basically spelled out. Who or what the monster was in the first episode is gratuitously foreshadowed, from the name of the film reflecting the monster, to the constant reminders of what happened, and the overtly poor dialogue that made the final twist so obvious that even a blind person could see it coming. You have to be subtle and careful with your hints. Too many that are too on the nose ruin what could be an interesting story. A decent example of the use of foreshadowing is The Sixth Sense, which I won't spoil, but this has many hints and clues throughout that the keen-eyed may spot, but are still buried well enough that the majority of the audience are surprised by the revelation. This is well done, so that on the second viewing most people can see the signs that pointed to the eventuality. An expert example is that of The Usual Suspects, which plays its cards very subtly and naturally, with all the clues being clear to see but only obvious at revelation. Even rewatching the film multiple times brings up newer, smaller, and more detailed indications each time. So, rule number 1, make sure the hints are able to be found without having a sign pointing to them. Leave breadcrumbs for people to find in symbolism and minute details or off-the-cuff comments that are available but not explicit. The second aspect that is important is that the foreshadowing actually leads to the outcome you produce. This may sound obvious, but quite often writers will try to make prior hints and clues fit into jarring conclusions. They will attempt to crowbar explanations that don't fit, and this completely wrecks your finale. A now classic example of this is the character of Daenerys in the Game of Thrones TV show. Daenerys ends up committing some rather violent and brutal crimes by the end of her story and is hinted at being mad like her father. However, the foreshadowing that is used to justify this rather abrupt change in character doesn't really hold water. People have pointed to her use of violence in the early stages of her story, but these were always relatively well justified. She used her power against the corrupt, the guilty, the treasonous, and the barbaric. She never inflicted death on innocents. In fact, she often went out of her way, against the advice of her advisors, to protect innocent people. This was in stark contrast to her outcome, which was so jarring it felt like a completely different character. You have to be careful that the clues you lay out actually point to what you are building towards. Game of Thrones did use foreshadowing effectively for other characters, however. Jon Snow's character arc is a great example of foreshadowing, where bits and pieces of his background are hinted at from the perspective of multiple characters who dream, speak, or allude to the truth of his parentage. As a result, the audience is able to put the pieces together before the character and then anticipate when, or if, he may discover it for himself. This is a great way to foreshadow, by making your readers pay attention to information in all scenes and how it connects with other characters who aren't present. When we finally get the revelation, it feels very satisfying for those who figured it out, and then not completely jarring for those who haven't. It's a pity what the show then chose to do with that revelation, but the build-up to and the moment of were excellent. So, Rule 2, make sure your foreshadowing actually points to the outcome you're planning. Trying to retroactively justify conclusions based on inconsistent actions isn't going to cut it. The final area that is crucial is making sure your hints don't undermine the tragedy or emotional punch of the outcome. In The Lovely Bones, many people felt that the outcome was given away too early, and then the revelation, while surprising for the character, didn't have the emotional weight that it should have or had been intended to have. This means that your reader is left unsatisfied and without much motivation to continue reading. If they know how things will end and can predict the emotional outcomes, it usually leads to a dissatisfied and flat ending. If your hints are there to be found and somebody finds them, there should still be anticipation about the outcome of how the character will deal with those consequences. As a result, it often feels that the foreshadowing wasn't well integrated into the novel and almost placed in afterwards in a Deus Ex Machina fashion. This means that the clues run inconsistently with the tone and atmosphere and undermine what should be a sensitive and tragic ending. The Fault in Our Stars, on the other hand, is a good example of foreshadowing being used to build the anticipation and tragedy of the story. It is quite obvious early on what the ultimate outcome of the narrative is going to be, but what Green does so well is to weave them into the story so that the sense of inevitability is used to enhance the story rather than diminish it. The foreshadowing is used to make the tragic subject matter more poignant, and to better reflect the themes of love and loss. On the second viewing, the story is all the more tragic because many of the consequences are outlined early on, but we don't see the coming loss as clearly as it's covered by the love. So, Rule 3, make your foreshadowing integrated into the story, so that it builds to comic or tragic ends in a more natural and satisfying way, even for those who have noticed the clues. So that's just a few ways that you can make foreshadowing effective in your story. There are more that I'll look into in the future as independent videos, such as using prophecies or creating satisfying endings. But for now, those are 3 tips to be starting with to make sure your foreshadowing is effective and impactful.